Hello and welcome back to Let's Read The Case for a Creator by Lee Strobel. In this video we're looking at Chapter 5, The Evidence of Cosmology, beginning with a bang. This chapter is Strobel's investigation of the cosmological argument for a creator. The idea of this chapter is to examine whether modern cosmology supports the notion that the universe was created. For those who've come across the cosmological argument before, it's usually used as an argument for God, often the Christian God. That's not exactly how it's being used here. The focus of this book is to establish the idea of a creator, but not to argue for a specific creator. A strong counter-argument to the cosmological argument is that it does nothing to establish the nature of a creator. But obviously I won't really be making that argument here. Anyway, let's get into the chapter. The chapter opens with the now familiar trope of Strobel telling a story. This chapter, it's about him coming across the recent findings in cosmology via Discover magazine. This prompted him to muse on whether cosmology fits with Christianity. Thousands of years ago, the Hebrews believed they had the answer. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, opens the Bible. Everything began, they claimed, with the primordial fiat lux, the voice of God commanding light into existence. But is that a simplistic superstition, or a divinely inspired insight? What do the cosmologists, scientists who devote their lives to studying the origin of the universe, have to say about the issue? So already Strobel's into the false equivalences. Regardless of what cosmologists have to say, the thousands of year-old beliefs of the Hebrews were simplistic superstition. Even if modern science agreed with them, they would only make them coincidentally correct. Also, there's no way that cosmology has established that the Genesis account of creation is correct. The best that Strobel can hope for is that it is established that the universe had a beginning. There's no way that it will agree with the absurd order in which things were created in Genesis, nor the myopic view of the cosmos that the Bible has. Strobel then goes on to give an overview of the Big Bang, and he does a reasonable job of explaining the basics, probably because most of it's taken from Steven Weinberg's book, The First 3 Minutes. Strobel particularly takes note of the point in the Big Bang when photons are created, quoting, "The universe was filled with light," as if this is some kind of indication of the Genesis account. However, his real focus isn't on the Big Bang at all, but rather on what caused the Big Bang. He quickly moves on from what happened to asking why. And here he quotes from Bill Bryson's A Short History of Nearly Everything, which is a popular science book for a general audience. And he criticizes Bryson's explanations for the possible causes of the Big Bang as being vague, which seems like setting up a straw man to make God seem like a reasonable explanation. In furtherance of this straw man, Strobel then goes on to discuss what has come to be known as the Bogdanov affair. This was a controversy regarding several physics articles written by two French brothers in 2001 and 2002. When these papers were later examined by other experts, they were found to be largely nonsensical collections of jargon and buzzwords. Not everybody agreed though, especially as they'd already been passed for peer review. Now, I don't really want to go into the whole affair, as although I find it interesting, there's actually quite a lot to it. I'll put a link in the description box below. The problem is with the way that Strobel is referencing the affair, saying, "I knew this investigation would take me into the slippery world of theoretical physics, where it's sometimes difficult to discern between what's profoundly scholarly and what's just plain silly. That was well illustrated in late 2002, when a debate broke out over a highly speculative theory from two French mathematical physicists about what might have preceded the Big Bang." Strobel is trying to besmirch theoretical physics as being baseless speculation that is without any grounding in reality. But the only thing he's got to back that claim up with is this Bogdanov affair. The problem with this is that he misses that the whole controversy was actually discovered by other physicists, and the poor quality of these papers was quickly established. Further, while these papers did make it through peer review, they've sparked no real interest in the physics community, and they've largely been forgotten. This is actually good evidence that the experts in theoretical physics can discern between what's profoundly scholarly and what's just plain silly. Strobel then goes on to dismiss a good chunk of theoretical physics with the following passage. "I wasn't interested in unsupported conjecture, or armchair musings by pipe-puffing theorists. I wanted the hard facts of mathematics, the cold data of cosmology, and only the most reasonable inferences that can be drawn from them. And that's what sent me to Georgia, to visit the home of a widely published expert who has studied and debated these issues for decades. Okay, so Strobel wants to draw an artificial distinction between what he calls pipe-puffing theorists on one hand and the cold data of cosmology, and between the established fact of the Big Bang and the more speculative hypotheses of what caused the Big Bang. This is the same technique that most apologists are forced to employ. This is just Ken Ham's historical versus operational science, or Ray Comfort's micro versus macro evolution. The reason they want to do this is they want to cherry pick the parts of science that agree with their religion and reject all the parts that don't. And in order to do that, they draw an artificial distinction between the parts they like and the parts they don't like. And this is just what Strobel's doing here. And the other completely laughable thing about this quote is that this widely published expert that he's going to interview is William Lane Craig. So despite Strobel's stated desire to get only the hard facts and the cold data, instead of actually interviewing a cosmologist, he's interviewing a theologian. Anyway, the next section is Strobel's introduction of William Lane Craig, and it consists of basically a page and a half of William Lane Craig's qualifications, his entire publication history, and it seems kind of bizarre to me, a brief physical description of what he looked like when he turned up. Anyway, then they get into the Kalam cosmological argument. Craig starts by giving Strobel a brief introduction to the history of it, and he ends up with a fairly good statement of it. The argument has three simple steps. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. Then you can do a conceptual analysis of what it means to be a cause of the universe, and a striking number of divine attributes can be identified. Now, one thing, and possibly the only thing, that I like about Craig is that he actually likes to put his arguments into syllogisms, and he's clear about what his premises are. Before we get into this argument in detail, I want to make a few preliminary remarks. Firstly, apologists using science to shore up the cosmological argument often equivocate on the word universe. The universe can refer to two distinct concepts, and it's important to actually be clear about which one we mean whenever we use that word. The first meaning of it is the entirety of physical existence. That is, absolutely everything that does exist has existed and will exist. And I'll try and call this the entire universe. And this is the sense in which the word is used in the cosmological argument. Now, the other sense in which the word is used is to describe that portion of the entire universe that we can observe and explore through scientific inquiry. And this is, broadly speaking, the way that cosmologists often use the word. Because it doesn't often include absolutely everything. For example, a cosmologist might say something like, our universe came into existence as a result of the collision of two five-dimensional brains. Now, clearly in this model, there are things outside of our portion of the universe, i.e. these brains, but they're inside the entire universe. So I'll call our portion of it the known universe. Now, the problem with having these two distinct meanings is that scientists rarely, if ever, talk about the entire universe. This means that although cosmological arguments purport to address the entire universe, appealing to cosmology is useless, since cosmology generally deals with the known universe, and we'll see this in a bit. Now, the second thing I want to point out is that when we're discussing cosmology and physics generally, our intuition is essentially useless. Our intuition about how the world works is based in the scale and energies in which we live, what is sometimes called the middle world. Relativity and quantum mechanics have shown that at very large or very small scales, or at very high energy, the world behaves in completely counterintuitive ways. And this means that any appeal to intuition at all when dealing with cosmology is completely useless. Okay, with that said, we now look at the first premise of the Kalam cosmological argument. And the first premise is that whatever begins to exist has a cause. Craig notes that apparently he didn't expect anyone to disagree with this premise, and was surprised when people do. Quote, "To me, this was absolutely bewildering. It seems metaphysically necessary that anything which begins to exist has to have a cause that brings it into being. Things don't just pop into existence uncaused out of nothing. Now, unfortunately for Craig, much of modern physics is bewildering, and this is no reason to think it's false. Secondly, simply asserting that he thinks it's metaphysically necessary isn't an argument. More broadly, the problem with this idea is that it's arguing about cause and effect based on how these seem to work within the known universe, when the point of the argument is to show how cause and effect works outside of the known universe. Craig says that effects must have causes. He is basing this entirely on our experience of how the known universe works. But remember that this premise asserts that this is how the entire universe works. I can think of no reason why the way that our portion of the known universe must necessarily reflect the entirety of reality. For example, suppose that the characters in a Harry Potter book become aware that they are in a book. It might seem reasonable to them to ask that since books in their known universe are written by magic quills, then it's reasonable for them to ask what kind of magic quill wrote the book that they're in. Clearly, the laws that govern their known universe are not necessarily the laws that govern the entire universe, and similarly for Craig's assertions that effects must have causes. Now, since Craig doesn't actually have any good philosophical reasons to support his first premise, he instead tries to shift the burden of proof, arguing against people who challenge him to actually prove his argument. Generally, people who take this position don't try to prove the premise is false, because they can't do that. Instead, they fold their arms and play the skeptic by saying, "You can't prove that's true." They dial their degree of skepticism so high that nothing could possibly convince them. When Strobel points out that the burden of proof is on Craig, he responds with, "Yes, but you shouldn't demand unreasonable standards of proof." Now, this is classic burden of proof shifting. Craig knows that he has very little support for his premise, so he needs to paint all skeptics as unreasonable, so that his meagre argumentation somehow seems plausible. Anyway, so after setting us up to expect only reasonable standards of proof, Craig tries to provide support for his assertions. Firstly, by saying that this premise is intuitively obvious and simply obvious based on his understanding of absolute nothingness. But this is just Craig's lack of understanding of absolute nothingness. To say that something came from nothing is actually a linguistic pitfall that invites you to imagine the scenario incorrectly. To say that the entire universe came from nothing is to say that it is actually incoherent to even talk about what was before the entire universe. It's akin to asking what's north of the North Pole. It's simply a contradiction. Therefore, the entire universe couldn't have come from nothing, because nothing, by definition, doesn't exist, so you can't come from it. If this sounds confusing, don't worry. No one really can imagine these kinds of things, and Craig trades on this to try and make his case. Strobel then asked Craig if quantum mechanics could offer a way in which the universe could come from nothing. The idea here is that in quantum mechanics, apparently empty space is actually permeated by something called a quantum vacuum, which is like a sea of particles popping in and out of existence. Now, several prominent physicists have proposed that the known universe may have done exactly that at the time of the Big Bang, and that essentially it's one massive quantum fluctuation. Now, Craig catches this equivocation and rightly points out that such an explanation can't be used to explain the start of the entire universe. As he puts it, if quantum physical laws operate within the domain described by quantum physics, you can't legitimately use quantum physics to explain the origin of that domain itself. That's page 101. And on this, I agree with Craig. You can't argue from the laws of the known universe to conclusions about laws about the entire universe, except perhaps in a probabilistic way. And even then, that's highly speculative. But don't worry, only a few pages ago, Craig was implicitly arguing that laws of causality in the known universe can be used to prove the laws of causality in the entire universe. Anyway, having presented little evidence to support his first premise, Craig now goes on to paint anyone who doubts it as biased or stupid. Quote, "Even the famous skeptic David Hume didn't deny the first premise. Hume wrote in 1754, I never asserted so absurd a proposition as that anything might arise without a cause. Nobody has defended such an absurd position historically, which again makes me inclined to think that this is just a corner they're being backed into by the evidence for the beginning of the universe. Now, there are two major problems with this. The idea that reality and causality are far more complex and unintuitive than we've historically thought only really took hold in the last 100 years or so. Prior to that, it was quite reasonable, based on the evidence, to think that all effects had causes, and all the causes preceded effects. Unfortunately, in the last 100 years, quantum mechanics and relativity have seriously undermined those ideas. Secondly, this is just an ad hominem argument by Craig. He can't refute the skeptics' objections, so instead he's making them out to be desperate defenders of some atheist dogma. And as Maya said last chapter, motivations don't matter. The arguments will stand on their own. Okay, Strobel and Craig now move on to looking at the second premise of the Kalam cosmological argument, that the universe had a beginning. Here Craig says that there are two ways that he thinks that he can prove that the universe had a beginning, philosophically and scientifically. So first we'll look at the philosophical, or what he calls the mathematical way. So, since the science establishing a beginning to the known universe is recent, historically apologists have relied on philosophical or pseudo-mathematical argument for a universe with a beginning. And the basic argument is this. They pointed out that absurdities would result if you were to have an actually infinite number of things. Since an infinite past would involve an actually infinite number of events, then a past simply can't be infinite. Craig goes on to illustrate why having an infinite number of things leads to contradictions. And the way he does this is by doing basic arithmetic on infinities. And he does this with an example involving an infinite pile of marbles. So imagine I've got a pile of marbles that is infinitely large, that is, I have an infinite number of marbles. If I gave you that entire pile of marbles, then you would have an infinite number of marbles and I would have none. So infinity minus infinity equals 0. Secondly, if instead I gave you every second marble, so one for you, one for me, one for you, one for me, and so on and so forth, you would end up having an infinite number of marbles, and I would have an infinite number of marbles. So therefore, infinity minus infinity equals infinity. Thirdly, if I, say, kept 3 marbles to myself and gave you the rest, then you would have an infinite number of marbles, and I would have 3 marbles. So infinity minus infinity equals 3. So what we've just shown is that infinity minus infinity could be 0, it could be infinity, it could be 3. So taking these 3 results together, we find that infinity minus infinity can have a number of contradictory values. And as Craig notes, this leads us to the conclusion that you can't do simple subtraction using the concept of infinity. And as my high school maths teacher would berate us, infinity isn't a number. Subtraction only works with numbers. However, the next step is where Craig departs from mathematics, saying, you see, the idea of an actual infinity is just conceptual. It exists only in our minds. Working within certain rules, mathematicians can deal with infinite quantities and infinite numbers in the conceptual realm. However, and here's the point, it's not descriptive of what can happen in the real world. So, Craig's reasoning here is invalid. He's saying, you can't subtract infinities, all things that exist can be subtracted, therefore infinities don't exist. And the problem with that is that he hasn't actually supported the idea that all things that exist can be subtracted. Consider a 10 centimetre line. How many points are on this line? The answer is, of course, an infinite number. We can take away the points at 1 centimetre long, 2 centimetres long, 3 centimetres long, so on and so forth. And what's left is still an infinite number of points on the line. Now, we get interesting questions down below Planck length, but really that's just a speculative or practical concern. The point is, there are genuinely strange and interesting mathematical results involving infinity, but none of these have any bearing on whether something infinite can exist. I mean, Craig seems to recognise this, actually, because then he goes on to argue that even if something infinite can exist, we still can't have infinite time. Quote, but if the past really were infinite, then that would mean we have managed to traverse an infinite past to arrive at today. It would be as if someone had managed to count down all of the negative numbers and arrive at zero at the present moment. Such a task is intuitively nonsense. For that reason as well, we can conclude there must have been a beginning to the universe. Note that the only argument against such a possibility that he actually offers is that it's intuitively nonsense, which really establishes nothing, as much of modern physics is exactly that. The good question to ask here is whether it's possible for the universe to have an infinite future. If so, then to paraphrase Craig, that's equivalent to somebody counting backwards through all the positive numbers to arrive at zero in the present moment. But of course that's not the case. I mean, the possibility of an infinite past is precisely as metaphysically possible as an infinite future. Neither is any more of a philosophical absurdity than the other. More to the point, Craig is begging the question here. His argument is, time must have a start. If the past is infinite, then it can't have a start. Therefore, it can't have an infinite past. Therefore, it had a start. His counting up to zero analogy assumes a starting point to count from, and that's exactly the point that's in dispute. That he can't imagine an infinite past is no real argument against it. Next, Strobel points out that if we can't have an infinite past, then doesn't this rule out an eternal deity? Craig's response is, time and space are creations of God that began at the Big Bang. If you go back beyond the beginning of time itself, there is simply timelessness. God did not endure through an infinite amount of time up to the moment of creation. That would be absurd. God transcends time. What Craig is essentially saying is that time started at the beginning of the entire universe, and there was simply no time before that. That is, literally nothing existed before the entire universe. Not time, not space. Not even empty space for nothing to be in. Space and time itself did not exist before the entire universe. And look, there are certain cosmological models of the universe that actually fit with this. But there's also models that don't. And the real problem is that you then need no God to explain the universe's existence. If time didn't exist before the entire universe, then by definition, the universe has always existed. That sounds crazy, but if there was literally no time, if all of time started at the Big Bang, then there was no time that there was never been a time when the universe didn't exist. At every time, the universe has existed. So therefore, it's always existed. If it's always existed, it didn't come from nothing, since to come from suggests a time before it existed, which we've established didn't exist. Anyway, that's the end of Craig's philosophical argument for the entire universe having a beginning. For a professional philosopher, Craig does a terrible job of advancing arguments that aren't simply arguments from intuition. I mean, to have studied modern cosmology and philosophy, and to still think that intuition is a useful guide to the extremes of reality points to him either fundamentally misunderstanding these topics or simply using these arguments as a rhetorical tool to defend his faith. I'll let you decide which you think that is. The next section is Craig introducing scientific evidence that he thinks supports his idea that the universe has a beginning. Now, the problem with this entire section is that he needs to establish that the entire universe had a beginning. But the evidence from cosmology really only establishes that the known universe had a beginning. I mean, the Big Bang is, as Craig rightly points out, a well-established part of cosmology, but it says nothing about whether there is anything outside of our known universe. There are several cosmological models in which our known universe is part of a larger ensemble of universes, and the Big Bang says nothing about whether this ensemble of smaller universes, that is, this entire universe, had a beginning or not. However, I don't want to spend a whole lot of time engaging with the scientific facts. Firstly, because there are much better explanations out there of why Craig gets cosmology so wrong. I mean, one of the best is a recent debate that he had with Sean Carroll, in which Carroll thoroughly debunked Craig's complete misrepresentation of cosmology. Secondly, as I just pointed out, it's only through equivocating on the word universe that cosmology can be relevant to the second premise. Modern cosmology, or actually more properly cosmogony, concerns itself only with the known universe. Okay, so having presented some poor arguments to support his premises, Craig now moves on to discussing the conclusion of the argument, that the universe has a cause. And as I've mentioned several times now, the best that he can hope for by appealing to cosmology is that he's established that the known universe has a cause. To illustrate this point, Craig uses a very poor analogy. Even atheist Kai Nielsen said, "Suppose you hear a loud bang, and you ask me, what made that bang? And I reply, nothing, it just happened. You would not accept that." He's right, of course. And if a cause is needed for a small bang like that, then it's needed for the big bang as well. This is an inescapable conclusion, and it's a stunning confirmation of the millennia-old Judeo-Christian doctrine of creation out of nothing. This is an appallingly bad analogy. The difference between a loud noise and the almost unimaginable rapid expansion of time and space themselves is more than just a mere difference between a small bang and a big bang. Also, a loud noise occurs within a framework of cause and effect that we are intimately familiar with. The reason that we think it needs a cause is simply because that's how we've observed our section of the world and our known universe to work. There is absolutely no experience that we can draw on to argue that the start of our entire, known universe needs a creator. The other issue I take with Craig's statement here is the idea that cosmology supports ancient Hebrew ideas about creation. It simply doesn't. The only point of similarity is the idea that there was a definite beginning. The Bible isn't even clear about whether God did the creation from nothing, and various sects of Christianity have disagreed over this. However, Craig is invested in the idea that science proves he's God, so he manages to define the definite beginning of time as the essential element of his creation myth, and the essential element of cosmology. Needless to say, other Christians would disagree, and plenty of science would disagree that it's even an essential part of Big Bang cosmology. Craig then moves on to trying to show that the cause of the universe, so he feels like he's established that there must have been a cause for the universe. Now he wants to show that that cause must also be his creator. Strobel asks him about the first cause, and Craig replies, "A cause of space and time must be an uncaused, beginningless, timeless, spaceless, immaterial, personal being endowed with freedom of will and enormous power. And that is a core concept of God." Strobel then goes on to make some tame objections to this. But either he doesn't have the knowledge, the insight, or perhaps the motivation to pose any decent objections. And what Strobel doesn't say, and the core problem with Craig's argument here, is that a timeless, spaceless, immaterial existence is the same as non-existence. As others have pointed out, to be timeless, spaceless, and immaterial is to exist at no time, in no place, and to consist of nothing. Without giving some detailed account of how that is even possible, this is really just gibberish. To further underscore how eager Craig and Strobel are to accept the Christian God, Craig says this: "Jesus of Nazareth proclaimed the truth of monotheism, and he was vindicated by his resurrection from the dead, for which we have convincing historical evidence. Consequently, we have good grounds for believing that what he said was true." Strobel accepts this without any objection. Here, Craig simply asserts that Jesus was resurrected, and he uses this to argue that the first cause of the universe must also be the God of the Bible. This is a completely false characterization of the historical evidence, and is circular reasoning to boot, since he's using the cosmological argument to support his claims that the Bible is correct, and here he's using the Bible to support his claims that the cosmological argument supports the Bible itself. In the next section, Craig gives his arguments for why the first cause must be a personal creator, or a being rather than just some impersonal cause. His first argument is this: there are two types of explanations, scientific and personal. Scientific explanations explain a phenomenon in terms of certain initial conditions and natural laws, which explain how those initial conditions evolved to produce the phenomenon under consideration. By contrast, personal explanations explain things by means of an agent, and that agent's volition or will. Craig then goes on to give an example and then explain why there can be no scientific explanation for the cause of the universe. Therefore, there can only be a personal explanation. Now, this is actually a good example of the false dichotomy fallacy, combined with the reification fallacy. There's no reason to think that these are the only two types of explanations, and Craig makes no attempt to justify why these are the only two options. Also, he's arguing that if we can give no scientific explanation, then the phenomenon must be an agent, as if our explanations are something more than just concepts we use to explain reality. I mean, the universe is the way it is, regardless of what explanations we can or cannot give to it. Craig's second argument for why there must be a personal creator is this. There are only two types of things that can be timeless and immaterial. One would be abstract objects like numbers or mathematical entities. However, abstract objects can't cause anything to happen. The second kind of immaterial reality would be a mind. A mind can be a cause, so it makes sense that the universe is a product of an unembodied mind that brought it into existence. Again, this is a false dichotomy, and asserting as fact philosophical ideas that are hotly contested. I mean, there's no reason to believe that there are only two types of things that can be timeless and immaterial. I mean, that's just a baseless assertion. And secondly, whether there are even immaterial, timeless things is still very much in dispute. He and other philosophers can provide little reason to believe that abstract objects or non-physical minds even exist in any useful sense of the word. Also, no one's ever been able to demonstrate any aspect of the minds that we know exist that is not fundamentally rooted in the physicality of a brain. I mean, the idea of an unembodied mind is very much in dispute, and so simply assuming that it can exist is begging the question. Craig's third argument for the existence of a personal creator is this. So if the universe were just a mechanical consequence that would occur whenever sufficient conditions were met, and the sufficient conditions were met eternally, then it would exist from eternity past. The effect would be co-eternal with the cause. Now, I can't work out whether Craig has just slipped into some sloppy thinking here, or whether this is deliberate equivocation. I mean, when he says, whenever sufficient conditions were met, he is implicitly talking about time. But time doesn't exist if the entire universe doesn't exist. So it's nonsensical to talk about conditions being eternally met, or about it existing from eternity past. I mean, if the entire universe has a finite past, which is what he's arguing, then it's simply nonsense to talk about eternity past. Craig goes on then to make a textbook argument from ignorance. How do you explain then the origin of a finite universe from a timeless cause? I can only think of one explanation, that the cause of the universe is a personal agent who has freedom of will. The last several arguments he's made have basically boiled down to this one strategy. Present an arbitrarily limited range of options, dismiss all but the preferred one, and make that your foregone conclusion. So to wrap up Craig's terrible collection of arguments, he concludes, we're free to look around for other evidence that the Creator still exists. Let's see if he answers prayers, if he raised Jesus from the dead, if he revealed himself in the fulfillment of prophecy, and so forth. I can't quite believe that someone who thinks of himself as a sophisticated theologian can argue that the efficacy of prayer, the claimed resurrection of Jesus, or the numerous biblical prophecies are actually evidence in his favour. If prayer actually did work, then we wouldn't need philosophical arguments for the existence of God. If it was verifiable that Jesus actually rose from the dead, there would be no doubters. If there were any specific biblical prophecies that came true, then this whole book would be unnecessary. I mean, the whole reason that apologists have had to retreat into sophisticated philosophy is because there is no plain evidence for God. Okay, The next 4 sections consist of Craig and Strobel examining various models, concepts, and theories in cosmology, and ultimately dismissing all of the ones that disagree with Craig's cherry-picked subset of Big Bang cosmology. The highlights of these sections include Craig beating up a strawman version of the oscillating universe model, misunderstanding the Bohr-Guth-Vilenkin theorem, and taking Stephen Hawking to task over his use of mathematics. Now, I'm not going to delve into this because it really does nothing to further Craig's argument, as really what it is a defense of Craig's argument against possible counter-arguments. And also, as I've said previously, I'm not going to argue the science because I don't think it's particularly relevant, and I don't think Craig's made his argument anyway. This section wraps up with Strobel wondering how an actual expert might react to Craig's claims. Quote, "As compelling as the Kalam argument undeniably is, does it really have the potential to change the mind of a scientist? Or would it merely become fodder for more and more creative, or as some might say, desperate, counter-arguments and objections? Christians often caution that a skeptic cannot be argued into faith. Yet, if someone were sincerely open-minded, could Craig's case be sufficient to prompt a personal verdict in favour of God?" So here we have a final example of Strobel making an implicit ad hominem argument. Despite Craig's arguments being unsupported, and him having failed to make any reasonable case for a creator of the universe, Strobel wants to make skeptics seem closed-minded and dogmatic. Craig then goes on to relate a story of how his doctoral dissertation caused the conversion of a prominent Eastern European physicist to Christianity. And although he gives no way of actually identifying who this person is, so there's actually no way of verifying whether this account is actually true, it contains enough detail for it to really be unsurprising to me. The account describes a deeply unhappy, ex-religious physicist struggling to find meaning after having lost her faith. Enter Craig with his assurances that God and physics can coexist, and suddenly she returns to religion. That such a thing could happen is hardly surprising. That Craig's arguments have convinced very few philosophers or cosmologists is actually much more telling. The chapter wraps up with Craig's summary. Certainly there have been earlier ages when the culture was more sympathetic towards Christianity, but I think it's indisputable that there has never been a time in history when the hard evidence of science was more confirmatory of belief in God than today. So the big problem that I haven't actually talked about yet is that even if Craig had managed to make his case in this chapter, it certainly wouldn't be reasonable to conclude that science confirms Christianity. I mean, despite this book supposedly not being a defense of Christianity, but rather an argument for theism in general, Strobel can't help but slip in these dodgy claims that somehow these arguments for theism must support Christianity in particular. And the only way he can claim this is to ignore all the aspects of science that flatly contradict Christianity, and only look at the bits that selectively support some few tenets of his faith. It's an approach that is blatantly dishonest. And that's the end of this chapter. Needless to say, I was underwhelmed by William Lane Craig's arguments. To summarise his argument, it seems intuitively obvious that if the universe has a finite past, it must have a cause. There are aspects of cosmology that suggest that our part of the entire universe has a finite past. Therefore, it was caused. Also, because this cause can't be inside our part of the universe, it must be God. It's really that bad an argument. I think that the only reason it's taken seriously is because it is very hard to get past our intuitions, and so Craig's appeal to them is actually hard to resist. That said, I'm hardly the first to raise these objections, and there's a reason that no one except apologists continue to use these arguments. Thank goodness that's over. Let me know what you think, and I'll be back next Thursday to look at Chapter 6, which is titled The Evidence of Physics, the Cosmos on a Razor's Edge, where we'll be looking at the argument from fine-tuning. See ya.